Welcome to the EcoParent Podcast Network. I'm Sam, the founder of EcoParent magazine. My partner Alexis and I had zero experience in the publishing industry, no money, and a new baby. But we quit our jobs, leapt into the unknown, and started EcoParent magazine anyway. It was absolutely freaking terrifying. But at the same time, it felt right. Just a few years into the journey, Alexis was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer that later found its way to her brain. It was utter chaos, navigating treatment schedules, caring for a 3-year-old, and trying to run a fledgling business, not to mention the general emotional havoc. Alexis didn't make it, but the rest of us did, and I've spent the years since raising a wonderful son and building EcoParent into North America's top print magazine for conscientious families. Even 10 years in, we're still a very small crew. If you send an email, it's probably me that will answer you. And this podcast network is a monumental step for us, another leap into the unknown. But like before, it just feels right. And I know that Alexis would agree that the podcasting team I've assembled here is an incredible group of people whose only goal is to inspire the best in you. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and let you listen to the podcast. Thank you so much for stopping by. You're the reason we do what we do.
This is the Raising Greener Teens podcast, and I am your host, Manda Ofox Gillespie. On today's episode, we ask, what is at stake for teenage brains with the influence of social media? I want to help you become the expert on caring for your own family and to help you empower your teenager to grow into the kind of curious, kind, and empowered adult who will do the same. But how? That's what I'm trying to figure out, and I am taking you along for the ride. Today, registered therapeutic counselor Hayley Newell joins us to go deeper into understanding the unique work that a teenage brain must do for individuation and its need for dopamine to help accomplish that work. And then what happens when social media circumvents that system and captures the attention of teenagers for commercial interests. We discuss all this and the power and potential of teens, the problems of cancel culture, and what to look for in your teen's relationship with social media. If you also want your teenager to benefit from today's guest, you can have them tune into my teenager Teensplain at the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much, Hayley, for joining us here on Raising a Greener Teen. I am hoping you can start with a little introduction to yourself and why it is that you were willing to say yes when I said, will you please come on and talk with us about what I'm calling the social dilemma and how it affects teenagers.
Yes, absolutely. Amanda, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure, as always, to sit and chat with you. I am a registered therapeutic counselor. I have a background in play therapy as well as somatic therapy and internal family systems therapy. I work with people of all ages, children, adolescents, adults. And I would say that my specific interest in this topic is because I just see myself sitting with a lot of questions around consequence. You know, here we are with this very powerful technology. We're starting to see some of the impacts, and what does that mean for teenagers?
I've had a preview of you talking about this issue, which is why, above all others, I wanted to have you to have this conversation with. And I'm hoping that you can give us a little bit of background about what we know about the teenage brain and what's happening and what we know about or are thinking that are the effects on that brain from social media.
So when we're talking about social media, we're talking about these social networking sites, which include Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, these kinds of online platforms that people use to build social networks or social relationships with other people who share similar personal or career content, ideas, interests, activities, etc. And I'm going to be speaking a bit about algorithms. So I also just wanted to give a bit of a definition of that. So algorithms in social media platforms are a means of sorting different content that gets posted based on what is perceived as relevant instead of the time that it got published, in order to prioritize which content a user sees first according to the likelihood that they will actually engage with that content. So that's a really important thing to understand about algorithms. And so they're essentially mapping and predicting human behavior based on past behavior and data mining techniques in order to create patterns of engagement that keep individuals engaged with the usual purpose in our capitalist society of exposing them to paid content in order to influence purchasing activity. So one thing that I think is important to note is that a key difference between social media and more mass media is that social media targets a specific person and predicts their behavior and purchasing, as opposed to targeting a more broad general group like women in their 30s or something like that. What we now know is that algorithms prioritize posts with the most engagement, and these tend to be posts with the highest emotional charge. And that gets into how our brain works and, why we respond in that way. But basically, this is a system that hyper amplifies extreme content. So in this way, algorithms are preying on our emotional vulnerabilities because they're prioritizing certain posts in order to change our behavior. So the consequence of this is that you can look at this as a systematic, purposeful takeover and control of the human mind. And given that our brains are still developing until approximately age 25, and that teen brains specifically go through a developmental leap that is similar in consequence to that of a preschooler, what is the consequence of this? What is the consequence of these developing brains engaging in social media with what I just explained about how that social media is systematically trying to influence and control behavior?
I find as a parent, I often want to believe that maybe there's like better or worse, or maybe that one doesn't really count. It's just more like texting. Is that really social media? So thank you for starting with the terms. I feel prepared for the next step, which is figuring out how dopamine, which seems like a pretty serious word, can also be linked to Snapchat, which seems like it should just be fun and play. So
Totally. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that essentially helps to control the brain's reward and pleasure centers. So it regulates movement and emotional responses. And specifically, this is important. It enables us not only to see rewards, but also to take action to move towards a perceived reward. So that's really key. So in the teen years, neural circuits utilizing dopamine increase, which makes teens gravitate towards more thrilling experiences and exhilarating sensations. You know this, and you probably have also had the experience of seeing these like glimpses of more of the adult emerging in the teen. Then they're just right back to being a child again, really, really quick. And I just wanted to name that so that parents know that that's totally normal and that's part of it. It's like, oh, there's the adult, there's the child, there's the adult, there's the child. That's totally part of it. So specifically, the teen years are characterized by these dopamine surges, which leads to increased impulsiveness and also something called hyperrationality, which basically means observing facts without the big picture. So as our brain is maturing, we start to move away from this hyperrationality to more bigger picture thinking. But it's something that's called gist thinking. And gist thinking is basically when we start to make decisions that disregard distracting details and instead get filtered through our lived experience, our emotions, our worldview, our education, and all kinds of other factors. So gist thinking requires the use of intuition and trusting something that my play therapy teacher calls your heart feelings, which is language that I just really love, especially for the teen years. But just to kind of plant that seed in the back of your mind that this gist thinking requires the use of intuition and our felt sense and our own personal lived experience. So just to kind of sum up, zoom out to the bigger picture of social media, essentially we're drawn to social media not only for connection, but because of this perceived reward, because we get a dopamine hit from that. And it is important to remember that it is actually less about the actual like. And I'm just catching myself referencing Facebook, which is dating me because Facebook is so old school in the world of social media. But even if you were to look at something like Instagram or Snapchat, any kind of response that you get from a post, it's more about the anticipation of that than when we actually get it. Because by the time we actually get it, the cycle just repeats itself again. So then we further engage with this system and this content that's specifically designed to stimulate our fight-flight system and our primal emotional system, this like black and white thinking, ecstasy and rage. And this releases stress hormones in our body. We become run more by our survival brain, and we react emotionally based on pleasure and rage. And we're subsequently rewarded again. And all of these neural pathways just gets deeper and deeper and deeper.
I do want to go a little deeper into this idea of hyper rationality versus just thinking. Could we go a little bit more into like why hyper rationality is a problem and why that might be a bigger issue for teenagers than it is for anyone else? And are some people stuck there?
So this goes back to basically our brains and our bodies being these receptacles for like tons of sensory data. And like, if you think of it sort of as taking in bytes of information, like computer data bytes, it's like billions and billions of bytes. We're taking in so much information that we're not aware of consciously. So our system has to filter out all kinds of things in order for us to be able to focus on what we're doing, in order to prioritize what the need is in the moment. Because otherwise, if we were consciously aware of all the information that we're taking in every second, it would be just completely overwhelming. So that's part of why it's a problem. And I think for teenagers specifically, if they are getting stuck here, this is part of what is likely leading to such increased rates of anxiety. Because with anxiety, it's all about this future planning, future predicting, trying to control outcomes and future scenarios before we're getting there, because there's fear. Essentially, we're facing the unknown constantly, and that's really scary for our brain. So if we're not able to develop the ability to filter out, prioritize, like, okay, I need to focus on this first, or, given XYZ, I can make a pretty educated guess that, ABC. If we're not able to do that, then we're going to be in this state of anxiety all the time. And we are seeing that with teenagers. And when you ask if people are stuck there, yes, people do get stuck here. And this relates to trauma, and how, if we, just to talk about it briefly, if we're living in a constant state of threat, or if we're in those survival responses all the time, it releases so many chemicals in our body that it can actually damage our brain. And so then it's really hard for us as we get older to be able to prioritize and disregard all those distracting details. And so it's not to say that we can't heal from that. We absolutely can. But it just requires then learning that and being able to discern, like, oh yeah, that is an actual threat. That's not an actual threat. People stuck in hyperrationality, they wouldn't necessarily be able to tell what is actually a threat and what's not.
So you're going to tell us a little bit more about what's going on in the brain, I think largely with dopamine and our dopamine receptors, that exacerbates, perhaps for lack of another word, this whole experience.
Well, just basically why the brain engages in these dopamine surges in the teenage years. Like, why would it do this to us? Why would it take us on this very emotional roller coaster? And it is essentially because of the purpose and the work of the teenage years, which essentially the first part of it is that it's time for us to change. When we enter the teenage years, it's time for us to change. Up to age 12, the child is ingesting the entire world, right? And, there's different layers to that, from being a baby to being a preschooler to being a young child. But it's all about taking in our parents, taking in what is considered right, what is considered wrong, all of these rules, the cultural context that we live in, you name it. We're just taking it all in. And now, as these young ones enter the teenage years, they're basically getting ready to leave the nest, so to speak. It's this first major step in individuating from the family, from the culture, from all of what they have been taking in. The child can no longer rely solely on the security of the parents. They're getting ready to maybe go off to school or go off traveling. So the security of the parents is not the same anymore when we're getting ready to, quote unquote, leave and move on. So teens can no longer fully rely on an external authority, and instead they're moving towards their inner authority. And so this is really important. They need to literally feel more at this time. And that's what dopamine does. It causes us to feel things more intensely. And so it's lighting this emotional spark. Everything is like the best ever or the worst ever. It's very dramatic. There's quite a life and death charge to things. And that's all related to dopamine. So I just want to, again, invite parents to really take that in, because it's, again, to normalize that these extremes that they witness and experience in their teenagers is really normal. But yeah, this is all dopamine doing this. And because of the addictive nature of dopamine, because of how it targets our pleasure centers, when we're not getting these dopamine hits, but one of the concerns that I have related to social media is that social media specifically hijacks this system and uses it against all of us, but in this context, teens, with these algorithms. So it's hooking them on these dopamine swings and taking them on this ride. The other thing about the work of the teenage years is that it's time for them to find their quote unquote chosen family. It's a time for them to to find like-minded individuals, people with similar interests and values. It's also a time for them to experience more novelty in their life. They're starting to ask the question, who am I, in a very big way, and what are they going to do with their life? So they need to be exposed to all kinds of new experiences. It helps to expose you to all these new things because it's giving you bravery and courage. Teens are so drawn to these exhilarating, thrilling, big experiences. Dopamine is helping expose you to new things because it's trying to move you towards your individual self. And I think this is just a really beautiful way to hold our teenagers, is that adolescence is really about discovering the quote unquote essence of who they are. And dopamine is key in this journey because it provides teens with the courage that they need in order to move towards who they really are and who they're going to be in the world.
And it makes it a lot easier as a parent to appreciate the what can feel also like the extreme, or the moments where you're like, oh, my teenager is behaving like a toddler, but I can't just pick them up and carry them to their bed. And also part of me is then like, well, so why is social media so bad? Because they can see all these different wonderful things out there, and they can be safely at home in their bedrooms.
Absolutely. There is that whole piece about social media. It's definitely not all bad. But basically what's being talked about is that social media encourages this passive imagination. All of these images are just kind of habitually produced. I think even from our own social media use as adults, that everything just starts to become content after a while. It's like we can feel and experience that there's a hunger for it still, but there's also an experience of like, it's just content after content after content, picture after picture after picture. We're being fed all of these images that get implanted in our imagination, like we take them in, but it's not necessarily coming from our self anymore. And given the takeover of the mind that I was describing earlier, and what we know about group psychology, specifically that the level of consciousness in a group is always lower than that of an individual, we become more like an animal. This is not to say that all group is bad or that there isn't a lot of beauty and wonderful qualities of groups. There are, but we also know that mob mentality is real, and there's this interesting animalistic creatureliness that takes over groups of people when they come together. So given all of that, given this kind of passive imagination quality of social media and group think and group psychology, and the fact that the teen brain is in development, my question is, how will the teenager do the crucial work of discovering who they are? And how will they know what is coming from them intrinsically versus the group? And is that important? And if they have an idea, how will they know that it's truly their own? And is that important? If they're in this kind of echo chamber of images that is really about appearances and how things appear versus how things maybe actually are, how will they come to know themselves within that context? And the fact that their brains are being wired up within that context. And if it is the case that a teen can't fully come to know themselves in that context, then how are they going to be able to trust their own intuition and their bodies and their heart feelings, as I was mentioning before? If they can't, it'll be very hard for them not to get swept up in the crowd, so to speak. This is not a new concern. There's been concern about peer pressure for ages. And also there's so much messaging about who we are supposed to be. And I think teens are much more vulnerable to that because their job as teenagers is to discover who they are. And they're being just completely bombarded by all of this. You're supposed to be that. You're supposed to be that. I think of myself and how much I am susceptible to all of the messaging that I get about who I am supposed to be. But then I think about how I'm already, almost 40 and my brain is developed. So if they're being targeted by this system that is purposefully trying to control their behavior, how will they ever know who they are? And then the other piece is that what we're seeing now with Generation Z, so those are folks born after 1996, this is the first generation of people with access to social media in middle school. We are coming to see that this group, generally speaking, there's much more anxiety, there's higher rates of depression, and also, really interestingly, they're more risk averse. So there's lower rates of dating in some instances and like obtaining driver's licenses later in life. There's a hesitation now about doing the quote unquote work of the teen years as quickly, like I'm going to go off and explore that thing, or I'm going to try that thing. And that's a little bit scary, but I feel like I have enough support to do it. They're actually sort of hanging back a bit more. And I think that this could partially be because of this hijacked dopamine system. And I know from working with clients that are in this generation that the fear of cancel culture is not a small thing. I would say that the quote unquote epidemic of cancel culture mental illness is maybe going to be the next wave that we see following what we have seen as quite a spike in anxiety. My curiosity is, are we now going to see a real cancel culture anxiety specifically? Because that's what I'm seeing with folks that I work with in their 20s specifically. So I think that social media has a potential of being more sinister because the young brain is being wired in real time by a system that wants to control them and their purchasing power, but also because it's happening in this virtual reality. And the connection that we're perceiving in that virtual reality is not three-dimensional, so to speak. We're not with the actual person experiencing all their nonverbals, etc. So if you imagine feeling excluded from a group in person and how painful that is, then imagine feeling that, but also isolated at home alone. And because of the emotional reactivity that social media breeds, it can just lead to even more extreme forms of verbal violence because you can't actually see the effect you're having on the person in real time. So that in a nutshell is what I feel concerned about in terms of the consequence on teens and their developing brains.
Before we get to what I hope is going to be some more positive aspects of what we can do, can we talk a little bit more about this cancel culture anxiety? The way it's played out in the last 10 years is pretty new. And the way that I think teenagers and young adults are running up against that is really different. What do you mean when you talk about cancel culture? And what do you mean when you talk about anxiety around it almost as a mental illness?
Yeah, totally. I guess I will preface this by saying it's not a new thing, but it's becoming something that we actually have language for now. And the newness of it is based on like the circles that it's happening in a very like quick and real time way. But basically it's this form of ostracization in which someone gets thrust out of a social group or a professional circle, whether it's online or social media or in person. And then the language around that is that the person's been canceled. And currently it happens a lot around these really big themes and problems that we're wrestling with in our society and culture right now: racism, social inequity, classism, sexism, sexual abuse. All of these issues right now are very, very charged and are in the public eye in a new way. It's not that it's new, those problems are of course not at all new, but they're in the public eye in a new way. So what I see with the young folks that have grown up with social media and have to some extent experienced online forms of bullying is that they are paranoid that things that they have done in their past are going to come back and destroy their life in the present. So this can take the form of like they're obsessively going through all of their old posts to see if they can find something, or going through other people's posts, or they don't want to put themselves out into certain situations for fear of getting canceled. They don't want to say certain things. They don't want to express certain ideas because they don't want to get canceled. There's a lot of fear around it. It's not even just, okay, we don't want you to be our friend anymore. It's like an elimination. It's like ceasing. We are going to cease considering that you even exist. That's kind of the way that it lands for me, and the way that I experience it through other people who are afraid of it. It's this sense of like, I'm just going to be erased. And it's very complicated because there are things that are happening in the world that are deeply painful. And there's been reasons why certain people haven't been able to come forward, for example, with cases of sexual abuse. And like none of that can be ignored. And I wonder if this is yet again a moment in history where we're going through a painful sort of adolescent growing pains kind of a moment where, because we were so far in one extreme of don't ask, don't tell, don't talk about it, the victims being perpetrated or it not being safe for them to speak out. And we have yet to find a bit more of a middle ground, because one of the things I feel concerned about with cancel culture is how it doesn't leave any room for redemption. You did this thing and you're done. That's it. Like your life is over now. And that just doesn't leave a lot of room for healing and for community to come in and hold space for these devastating things that have happened. So yeah, that's a little bit about cancel culture.
Thank you for that explanation. I really also appreciate this new way of thinking about the teenage years, because there's been a fair amount of attention over the last 20 years as we look at how divided the US society has become, and increasingly also Canadian society. And so we can oversimplify that in lots of ways. In the US, it becomes oversimplified about Democrats versus Republicans. But the truth is that we are dividing along all sorts of lines, where more and more people only know how to kind of behave and be neighborly and get along with those who are just like them. I have strong feelings about this. Personally, I'm very much part of the group who thinks this is tearing apart the fabric of our society. And now I see all of a sudden why this is so deeply embedded and must begin in the teenage years, right? If When else would you be as likely to want to get to know people who are different than you? Right? Your dopamine is high. Maybe you're attracted to someone. Maybe you just want to like join their sports team or whatever, right? There's this opportunity to actually develop deep friendships with people who are not like you. So maybe then when you start developing your gist thinking, I think is what you called it, that part of your value, your heart system, your filter system is one that includes more spaciousness about differences. How scary would that be to try to do that expansion in a time when you're also really worried about being canceled, or where you just feel like you're living in a society where the other young people around you are more judgmental than they perhaps have ever been in the past. And certainly, wouldn't it seem safer just to stay at home and look at things or interact with people who you already know, think just like you, look just like you, live near you, etc. So I I don't want to feel despair totally, but this does make me feel yet more intensity around, oh wow, we need to expose our kids to something else as well. So, like, at what point is something a social media addiction? And do we have examples of healthier ways to engage with social media as adults that we can maybe then move into with young people?
Yeah, totally. And I just want to say that what you just named was really beautifully said, Manda, and I totally agree. And what I hear in what you were saying is just how to utilize it. Like, okay, this is what's happening with the brain and the dopamine system. Let's grab onto it and like use it for these really beautiful intentions of like broadening our scope and our spaciousness for holding difference. That's amazing. So, yes, I echo all of that. So, in terms of addiction basically it's when things are becoming disruptive to your life. So, you can look at it in a few different ways. Is it affecting like healthy routines, things that you need to do to be like a healthy, functional human being in the world? So, one thing that's really key with social media addiction is, do you take your phone to bed at night? And is it the first thing that you wake up with and look at in the morning? So, I think if nothing else, if people can start to challenge themselves to put it away at least an hour before bed and at least an hour upon waking, this is so huge. And the reason why it's so huge, because it really does relate to your circadian rhythms and sleep hygiene and keeping your brain active. But it's also that these are times where if you are waking up and going right away to social media or news even, you're exposing yourself to this huge collective experience, this huge collective unconscious. You're exposing your own system to all of the biggerness of the out there world. You're going external before you're going internal. So if people can just flip that around to, again, in terms of teens, I'll frame it with teens. They're meant to be developing their inner authority. So the first thing in the morning is, hello, me. here's me, myself. What's something I can do to connect with me? Even if it's just as simple as like, I wake up and I go to the bathroom and I wash my face and I go get a cup of tea or coffee and I sit down for a few minutes before I do the immediate phone thing. Because I think we all know that it's very immediate for most people. It's the first thing that they reach for. So then also it's like, is it impacting relationships? Would I rather, when I'm trying to have a conversation with somebody in person, do I find that I'm consistently checking my phone? Is it distracting me from things that I have connected with in myself that I really want to be doing? Like, for example, if you really want to be learning how to play a musical instrument, but you are constantly wrapped up in your phone, it's like, okay, let's see what we can do so that we have a little bit more boundary around that, so that we can do this thing that we have determined we truly want to do. It's not a should anymore. It's not I feel like I have to. There's a real values alignment here, because if we are engaged with those things, then we probably won't need. It's the same with other kinds of addiction. When we're connected to the thing of value, really, we don't need the thing that is like trying to get us the connection that we really want. Is it impacting healthy routines, eating, sleeping, relationships? And is it taking us away from things that we truly do want to be doing? So if we notice that, if we can be honest with ourselves about that, then those are some places to start. And I do often bring it back to parents and modeling, because again, they're learning primarily from our modeling. So if we are taking our phones to bed and doing all these things, then especially with teenagers, going to be impossible to support them to do otherwise. Because the other thing about teenagers is they're like the best, BS detectors on the planet. And so no one's going to get away with, well, you're doing it. So modeling, I think, is huge. And I think having just really open, honest conversations about it, like going to your teen and saying, hey, I really struggle with taking my phone to bed with me. I'd really like to not do that. What's that like for you with your iPad? Like, just being kind of real with them. Teenagers, it's a lot about authenticity and realness. And then like really jumping into this whole dopamine roller coaster with them. Like, okay, I see that you really want to express in that way. I want to make that happen for you in a way that's really safe. So like, yes, and it's like improv. Yes, and.
I want to practice the yes and a lot. I was wondering if there's a documentary that's not so new now called The Social Dilemma. It's on Netflix and probably other sites at this point. One of the things I really liked about that documentary was that it starts talking about how social media is not really free. And
Yes.
just getting adults, teenagers, everyone to start thinking about how do these places make money and what they're selling to make that money. Do you want to sort of tell what you think is like the big takeaway from that documentary? And would you recommend that people have their teenagers watch it?
I would totally recommend that teenagers watch that. Watch it with your teenagers. I think that would be awesome. So one of my biggest takeaways from that documentary, The Social Dilemma, is Jaron Lanier, who's a computer scientist and a virtual reality pioneer. He was interviewed in the documentary, and he said, we've created a world in which online connection has become primary, especially for younger generations. And yet, in that world, anytime two people connect, the only way it's financed is through a sneaky third person who's paying to manipulate those two people. So we've created an entire global generation of people who were raised within a context with the very meaning of communication, the very meaning of culture as manipulation. And I think I couldn't really have said it better than that in terms of my fear around social media and the impact on the teenage brain, is that it's like, how will they even know that that's the water that they're swimming in? So how could they know that anything else is possible? And you can take it a step further and challenge me, and I invite the challenge of like, maybe it's not a problem. This is maybe being raised in that culture and that context is going to lead to something that we can't perceive yet. And I also know that younger generations tend to have more answers than the older generations. And so that's also something to hold. But yeah, it's like, how do we know what we don't even know, what we haven't experienced? That's the scary part for me. But I guess the flip side of that is that because these teens have these amazing brains and they are needing to be exposed to novelty and new things, maybe they are the ones that actually have the solution to all of this. It might be that we need to support teenagers to take this challenge by the horn, so to speak, and run with it. Like maybe it's not for us to come up with the answers, but more to hold the space in the container for them to come up with the answers.
I do really like the idea. Perhaps that is the same thing about all of parenting teenagers or being in close relationship with teenagers that I have found, which is just at that moment when I often feel the most despair or most like, oh my gosh, this is insane or intense or crazy. There'll be that other side where I see that this generation also is being raised with so much empathy and kindness and relational awareness, and in some ways also both damaged by their fears, but also deeply can be deeply accepting of others and all their differences. And if you have any other kind of positive things that you're seeing with your clients or out there in the world that you would recommend that we check out, witness, know the story of, read, etc., tell us.
There's definitely a great book called The Teenage Brain, which if you Google the teenage brain, it'll pop up right away. The Teenage Brain, a Neuroscientist Survival Guide to Raising Adolescents and Young Adults. So that would be one that I recommend. And I would say to go right to the source and ask them about their experience and about what they see are the challenges and what they see are the needs, and see if you can kind of get right into it with them and see what, and I say this to myself too, what we can learn from them, given that they are living this real-time phenomenon right now as we speak,
Taking notes on all the wonderful things you say. And do you have a website or a place that people can find out more about you?
Yes, definitely. My website is hayleynewell.com. And I do actually have a page of resources on my website. And I'm going to be updating it again shortly with a few more things. And then you can also message me directly through the website if you have any questions or want some more specific guidance or places to go. And I'm always happy to respond to emails.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hayley. This has been educational, interesting, only a little bit fear-inducing, and a lot inspiring. So thank you for your time today and your great big brain and heart.
Thank you so much, Manda. Always a pleasure. Thanks so much for doing this. It's really important work.
Hi, Zella.
Hi.
Thanks for coming and doing this.
Yeah, of course.
We're talking about the teenage brain and social media. One of the things that really stood out for me that I liked about how Hayley addressed this issue was talking about the work of a teenager. I'm wondering what you think is the work of a teenager after listening to today and from your own experience.
Well, to be honest, I never really thought about it. One of the things I really recognized and kind of saw myself in was the part where she was talking about how teenagers really snap back and forth between being children and adults. And I really was like, yeah, I see myself doing that all the time.
I'm wondering, one, if you felt validated as a teenager, hearing that you're supposed to be developing your own desire to be your own authority, but also, did it totally freak you out like it did me to know that social media is interfering with that dopamine?
It did a bit, but just like in my life, personally, I don't see that much just because I'm on a really small island. And a lot of people, including some of my friends, that since they're getting all of this dopamine from their screens, they don't really try going out into the world to find it. There being social media, you would maybe look it up on Google or whatever, TikTok, and be like, oh, whoa, this is so crazy. This is giving me such like an adrenaline rush from watching this person jump off a cliff. What's going to happen to them? Instead of actually going out and doing it. So it just kind of takes away a lot of, I think, motivation.
At the end of this, Hayley really challenges parents to look at their own habits with their phones, with social media, etc. I'm wondering what you see in the adults in your life and whether they are really being the models that they could be.
Well, I think when I see adults, at least my parents, usually they're working, which involves a device. Yeah, they're modeling being on your phones. And I get like, that's work. But since I'm not doing the work on your phone, I don't know it's work. So it just seems like you're on your phone.
And yes, she is talking about me. What would you encourage me to do in order to develop healthier relationships with my phone?
I think, how you manage your time is kind of up to you and how you feel it's best. But I know a big one for me that really annoys me is when you're talking to someone and they're on their phone. Even or in the middle of a conversation, they get a notification or they see they've got an email or work thing. And instead of delaying that a couple minutes or saying, okay, I'm going to go now, they will just pick up their phone and start emailing, texting someone, Snapchatting, whatever, thinking they can do two things at once, but really they just kind of end up ending the conversation with that.
And I'm wondering if you have tips like that you have found that have helped you, that have felt better to you around your own relationship with your phone and social media that you would recommend for other teens.
I try to go off my phone an hour to 30 minutes before bed. That, and I always put it on like nighttime mode where you don't get notifications, it doesn't buzz. Because when you put it on silent, it buzzes and lights up still. And in the morning, I tend to, obviously my alarm goes off at some point, so I turn it off. But I try to go and eat breakfast or go to the bathroom, like Hayley was saying, before I go on my phone. And I do notice myself sometimes not doing that. And then I'm like, oh, no, I always feel a little icky. But I try not to, if me and my friend are going to go make food or go on a walk, I try not to bring those places with me because, you're with the person you were talking to on your phone earlier with, but now that you're with them, you shouldn't need it. Oh, and I don't bring it to the dinner table. That's been like a family rule forever, is you just don't bring your devices to the table. And I actually love that rule.
If you were to give last advice to parents around this, what would it be?
I would say don't always be on your kids' back about them being on their phone when you are always on your phone. Try to model what you want them to do so they can see that in you too.
Thank you, Zella.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Raising Greener Teens. I hope you learned something today to both empower and inspire you and your teen. Until next time, bye.
So, if you listen to podcasts or watch YouTube, you've probably heard it 1,000 times before. The plea to subscribe and leave a review or a comment. Well, here we are again. But seriously, the review is especially important to us, as it has a huge impact on our discoverability amongst the zillions of podcasts all competing for your attention. So please consider leaving a review. And heck, we'd really love to hear your feedback. This pilot episode of the EcoParent Podcast Network was made possible with the generous support of Ontario Creates. Thanks for listening.